Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
I'm Tony.
And hopefully not a whole lot of dust is collected on your book since the last time you joined us for Tactics, the 10th anniversary edition by Greg Koukl, a game plan for discussing your Christian walk. Convictions, I'm sorry. And so far we've talked about the Columbo tactic, the biggest tactic. It's broken down into 3 parts. We've covered 2 of them. And essentially what they boil down to is 2 questions. The 2 big questions you can ask is, how do you know that?
Mm-hmm. Or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, what do you mean by that? Yeah. How do you know that? And how did you come to that conclusion? So those are kind of the 2 parts of a 3-part step within this very important tactic. And so we've covered 2 of them so far. And in the chapter today, we're kind of taking a stop to say, well, if we can use these, what if it's used against us? And so we'll get into kind of the bigger implication of that. But today we're talking about kind of 2 steamrolls maybe that we'll encounter with people.
Now, he does have a chapter on steamrolling.
Well, that's
and
true too.
He does have a chapter on how to defend against the Columbo tactic.
Right.
And so this one is kind of he's going to give us a couple of rescue devices when folks ask us questions with regard to this, right? So as you mentioned, the first 2 Columbo questions are vital in keeping us in the driver's seat while our tactical game plan unfolds. Right. So
all we're doing is asking questions.
That's right. Yeah. So they can also be handy to get you out of tight spots as well. Right. So that's what he wants to talk about today. How do we get out of tight spots? What's a tight spot? Well, excuse me, he says, you might find yourself in 2 specific circumstances in which you are awkwardly on the defensive. That's right. Now, remember, we want to be on the offensive. So when we're on the defensive, that's kind of not where we want to be. Right. Now, it's okay for us to want to, and in fact, to defend our position. In fact, we want people to ask us the Columbo questions, right? We want them to say, what do you mean by gospel? Mm-hmm. Oh, I'll tell you what the gospel is. Yeah, right. How did you come to that conclusion? We want that, right? So we don't shy away from those questions, right? But we don't want to be on the defensive with regard to questions that puts the other person in the driver's seat, right? And they control the conversation, right? And so he's going to talk to us about 2 of these specific circumstances. The first one is he calls the professor's ploy, right? And the second one is getting out of the hot seat. So let's begin with the professor's ploy. What in the world is the professor's ploy, right? Well, he says some professors are fond of taking pot shots at Christianity with remarks like, the Bible is just a bunch of fables, right? And he says, well-meaning believers sometimes take up this challenge and attempt a head-to-head duel with the professor. Right. Now, notice, the Bible's just a bunch of fables. That is a claim that the professor has made, right? And as we have been learning, if a person is making a claim, it's their responsibility to defend it, not our responsibility to defend against it. Right. At least not initially, right?
We say that they have the burden of proof for that. Right. They've made the assertion. Now it's up to them to be able to defend that.
Yes. And so he says, well-meaning believers sometimes take up the challenge and attempt a head-to-head duel here, right? He says, don't make this mistake. It's right-hearted, but wrong-headed. Right.
Yeah, you can launch into all the facts that the first chapter of new evidence that demands verdict. You can have it memorized, and you're constantly giving out fact after fact, 5,000 manuscripts and attestation, and here's the way that it was translated through all these centuries, and here's the different types of issues that we can run into, and here's all the counterclaims to that, and all the professor has to do is go, Nope, that's not true.
That's not.
Well, okay, but now we have to use the Columbo tactics in order to put him in the burden of proof seat.
Exactly, and that's what he tells us. We just use our Columbo questions at this point and let the professor explain himself or herself, right? I mean, they've made the claim, so we ask the question and allow them to be the professor.
Right, yeah, that's what you're paying them for.
Yeah. Right. But he says that there's a ploy that can be made, right? It's a pitfall. It's a distraction, right? It's intended to kind of derail our efforts.
Right.
And so the professor may sense our maneuver and then try to turn the tables on us, as it were. And so he says that the professor might say something like this. Oh, you must be one of those fundamental Christians who thinks the Bible is the inspired word of God. Okay, I'm a fair man and we have a little extra time. Why don't you take a moment and prove to the rest of the class that the Bible is not filled with fables? Whoa.
Yeah. Okay, now go.
Yeah. And we do have a little time, so yeah. In 2 minutes, prove that the Bible is not filled with fables. Right? So now what do? Right here, the professor's kind of turned the tables on you after you've asked him a few Columbo questions there, right? Now, so Greg Koukl tells us we shouldn't take the debate. The why don't you prove me wrong ploy is what's going on here, right? No. We should shift the burden back where it belongs on the one who made the claim. After all, you haven't made any claim yet.
Right.
You've just been asking questions.
Right. I mean, you might think that this is the perfect opportunity to present the gospel. This is your one and only shot to talk to 30, 150, however what the size of the room is. You've got your facts, he's got his, and you're given the last 2 minutes of the game to make the push for the gospel. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's probably not going to be your best tactical route to take.
Right. Since he's in control of the microphone, so to speak.
Right. Yeah.
So we shift the burden of proof where it belongs back on the one who made the claim. He's the one that made the claim. He is the one, or she is the one that's responsible for backing up the claim they made, not you being responsible for proving them wrong. Mm-hmm. Right. And so he suggests we respond something like this. Professor, I actually haven't said anything about my own view. For all you know, I could be on your side. My own view is irrelevant. It doesn't really matter what I believe. I'm just a student trying to learn. I'm asking for clarification and wondering if you have good reasons. That's all.
Right. And this is chemistry class. What are we talking about this for?
And so, so what we've done now is put the burden back on the professor, right? Because the professor tried to put the burden on us, and we haven't even made a claim, right? And so we just admit it. I haven't really said my view. I'm just wondering, I'm just asking questions and asking you to clarify what you're saying.
Right. You're kind of playing hot potato with the burden of proof, and what you've said is, no, I didn't ask for this. You're the one that lit the potato on fire.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, if he gives an answer, thank him for explaining himself and either ask another question or you let it go for the time being, right? Yeah. And so, we don't need to be afraid to question our professors. Go figure, right? So let me say that again. We don't need to be afraid to question our professors. In fact, that's what we should be doing. Questioning our professors. Right. They're the ones that are, as you said, being paid to be able to answer the questions, right?
Yeah. They have the knowledge. We don't.
Yeah. So challenge them on their terms, though, not, on our terms, right? Not on their terms. And, of course, we're to do it with grace and respect and tact, right?
Yeah, and that's what the questions are designed to do. You're going to shift the burden of proof back onto them, which is originally theirs to start with, and you're going to ask, how do you know that, and what do you mean by that, and how did you come to that conclusion?
Exactly.
And because that person's a professor, they've probably done this 100 times before. There might be something within those questions that you're asking that you're going to get an interesting education on.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, like you said, they're the professor for a reason, and hopefully they have something to teach you. And even if you vehemently disagree with it, you can utilize that time to come up with a proper understanding from their perspective of, whatever information that they're, hopefully this isn't just coming up in, a conversation where you're reading Romeo and Juliet and all of a sudden that there's a soliloquy in there about, God being dead or, what have you. So hopefully there's an exchange of ideas that you can get out of this, and you can still drive maybe, with the little bit of time you have left, a conversation that might challenge that. And so for the people in the class who are listening, that they can kind of pick up that the professor's being challenged, and they might come to you afterwards and ask follow-up questions, or you might end up dealing with it throughout the rest of the semester.
Yeah, good. So he says, whenever anyone, professor or otherwise, makes a controversial claim and then says, you prove me wrong, don't play their game, right? Don't let them make you do the work that they should be doing. They made the claim, right? So here's the principle that he wants us to understand from this. He says that you are in control of your side of the conversation. You don't have to allow yourself to be dragged into a compromising position you do not want to be in. Don't be nasty or defensive, but don't allow yourself to be bullied. When you stay in the question mode, you're in the safety zone, right? So you're in charge of your side of the conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
So as long as you don't stand up in class and say, Jesus is Lord, everyone here will burn into hell, then no one can use the Columbo questions against you.
Yeah.
So the second kind of issue that we have is called getting out of the hot seat.
Whoa.
Yeah.
It sounds like we were just in the hot seat.
I mean, if your grade is on it, I think Ben Shapiro always has the thing about if you're talking politics in class, get the A rather than, have the argument. And
Go for the A, not the argument.
You might win the battle but lose the war type deal. And I think that's pretty solid. But, there have been times where I've been in a class where, we're talking about the modern worldview, and so we're reading books about how the formation of the worldview of kind of how we got to the modern worldview, what encompassed it. And I had a bonus question one time by the professor, and I made my claim that evolution would be one of those kind of areas where it would overturn in the next however many years of what the question asked, and I got bonus points for it. And he had a smiley face and said, "Very cool. Interesting." So the not that I viewed this person as hostile by any means, but sometimes you just don't know when you're putting it there. So I felt it was okay to put a little old English on a bonus question, and so it is okay to have those type of discussions. I thought it was a good question too. So here the hot seat is people that kind of know more than you, and so obviously you understand why Tony took the professor one and I took the people know more than you. So that's pretty easy to suss out there. But getting on the hot seat, sometimes you will face an aggressive challenger you're not equipped to handle, and you are in over your head. He or she is in the driver's seat, and so. I'm sure we have all done this. We've all watched YouTube debates, and you're like, oh, I can take this challenge and this challenge. And then someone will say, oh, well, the metaphysical claim of utilizing the Greek personal pronouns of this, and you're just, well, I was doing good against this imaginary opponent, but I couldn't even imagine what the rejoinder would be to this person who knows a lot. And, they're the big atheist. I would not win in this conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, first, take a breath. We don't need to feel under pressure to immediately answer every question asked. Instead, practice what Greg Koukl calls here a little conversational aikido. And
so are you saying that we don't need to be able to answer every question that somebody asks?
Hope not. I hope not. Now, it is always good to have a proper understanding, and we'll get into a little bit in later chapters as well. But sometimes you just come up with someone who has this big grand understanding of exactly the life in first century Jerusalem during Roman occupation. And so when you're talking about the life of Christ or how the crucifixion might have happened, this person could just kind of steamroll you with fact after fact of, there's no reason for Jesus to have been buried in a tomb. Why is that? Where is that? And I was just watching a debate on just that question of whether or not Jesus was buried in the tomb, and there's a lot of interesting ideas out there, and so you might not have an answer for even the outlandish ones, let alone the big ones. And so
should we be even thinking having an answer for outlandish questions? I mean, goodness knows. Right?
Yeah, right.
If that's the case, every wild question, I mean, where would it end? Right.
Right, and there are quite a few if you've been out there. So practice what's called this conversational Aikido, and so Aikido is kind of this kind of martial art where you're utilizing the other person's kind of momentum in your favor. And so the minute that you feel overmatched, shift from persuasion mode to fact-finding mode. So that's what we're doing with the Columbo mode. We're asking the two questions. What do you mean by that? And how did you come to that conclusion? Yeah. And so that's kind of you're asking that question to kind of move the conversation along to where you want. But now you're really trying to figure out what they're talking about and how did they come to that conclusion. But again, we're still utilizing those two questions. Here, we're just kind of staying on track. So it could sound something like this. It sounds like you know a lot more about this than I do. I've said that a lot of times, and it's good. It's humbling. It makes you a real person. You don't have to have, especially if you're doing this behind a keyboard and you're talking to somebody, it's easy to hit Google and pretend that you know a lot more than what you're talking about. And so it's also hard to clarify, but here you're having a conversation with somebody.
It's honest, it's humble, it's,
right. I think it's respectable for someone to say, I don't know, especially in this day and age. If you were talking to an atheist and they say, well, boy, I just don't know about this. Can you give me some time? You'd probably have just the same respectful, conclusion to that. So you might say, you have some interesting ideas. The problem is all this is new information to me. I wonder if you could do me a favor. I really want to understand your points, but you need to slow down so I can get it right. Would you take a moment to carefully explain your views and your reasons for it to help me understand better? So you're just saying, wow, this is really new. Can you explain it maybe in a little bit more detail? Can we go back to your first point because you're on point 6. So that's kind of how to tee it up a little bit. And so when all your questions have been answered, end the conversation by saying the magic words. Let me think about that for a minute.
Wow, that's magic words, right?
Right. You've given me a lot to think about. Can we come back to this? And that might not always be able to be done because, you could be heading on train A. They could be heading on train B later. And so just take it as an educational point. Maybe you're able to ask some clarifying questions that might get them to think about something that you're able to kind of know about. But this is kind of the assumption that someone is, giving you all this information that you're having a conversation to where you might be able to come back to it. So let me think about it. Maybe we can talk about this more later. These words, let me think about it, are like magic because once you say them, you free yourselves from any obligation to respond further at that moment. Right. Then you go back and you find all the books you can on the subject. You write down all the points that you can kind of remember that they made that were convincing to you, that were less convincing to you, that weren't convincing to you, and have responses to them. That's
and you may not be able to respond, as you mentioned, because they're in train B with that person. But now you've prepared yourself for anybody else that may have that question. Right. You can respond to them.
Yeah, right? And again, this isn't a torpedo where you go back and you go, I've got a 6-page thesis here. You go back and you ask certain questions like, hey, remember when we were talking about this? I've read a little bit more, and what it seems is this is the case. Can you help me understand what you mean by this, or how did you come to that conclusion when these experts say differently? Right. And it might just start all over again. And so you have to decide whether or not it's worth your time. And, if you're honestly considering learning more about it from a person who knows more than you, but, it's rare that you would come into contact with someone who knows, a super abundance about, whatever specific item you're talking about. You might run into Tony and talk about the problem of evil, and he might be able to tell you the entire history from 1,500 years of what different philosophers have taught on problem of evil. But
I'd probably start with Genesis 3.
Oh, sure, at the beginning.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the two big points that we can come into conflict with is this professor, this mode, and it could be someone who's not a professor. It could be a boss. It could be someone of authority. It could be someone who's kind of has the floor, so to speak, and then also meeting the person who knows way more than you. Greg Koukl here says when we avoid questions, that may be the only recourse we have. When this happens, it may be helpful for you to narrate the debate, to kind of go with the flow, and your Columbo questions are going to help clarify to you what you understand, what you don't understand, but still moving the conversation. Mm-hmm. So when a cherished view is at stake, it's not unusual for people to raise empty protest objections that sound worthwhile, but simply can't be defended once examined. Narrating the debate often exposes a lack of substance behind the bluster. So sometimes when that person's raging about how he's going to make you not a Christian by the end of the semester, he's done it to 13 classes before you, and will probably continue to do it after you. And so it's it's one of those things where asking those questions of what do you mean by that, mm-hmm. and how did you come to that conclusion might kind of stop them. Hold on. I was not expecting you're supposed to sit there and take it, or the person who knows a lot may only know up to a certain point where you ask them, what do you mean by that? And how did you come to that conclusion? So, I read it in a book and I was able to regurgitate it back to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, here's William Lane Craig who says this mm-hmm. in opposition to that. What do you mean by that?
Let me just say one more thing about what he says about narrating the debate. He gives this as a tip. Right. He says it's a simple way to bring clarity to a discussion or pull the curtain back on someone who is illicitly dodging your point, right? This person may try to change the subject or assert their particular point. So when this happens, it may be helpful for you to narrate debate. Take a moment to step outside of the conversation, in a sense, and describe to your friend the turn the discussion is just taken. Right? In other words, you want to kind of step out and put the discussion on the table so both of you can look at it here, right? He says you might want to say something like this. I want you to notice the turn our talk just took. First, you made a fairly controversial statement, and I asked you a couple of questions about it. So far, you haven't answered them. Instead, you've taken off in another direction. Before we move on to a new topic, would it be okay with you if we finish the old one? I'm really interested in your response, right? So what have you done here? Well, what you've done is you've explained what has happened. That's what he means by narrating the debate, right? And that way it puts the, it allows that person then to, puts the burden of proof back on that person for them to explain the original claim that they've made, right? So instead of them being, changing the subject and that sort of thing.
Yeah, attacking you personally.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So they name call and you say, well, let me, he says, wait a minute, right? He says, notice what's happened here. I asked you a question, and what you did instead of answering the question is called me this particular name. Now, I may or may not be that, right? Yeah. But I like to hear what you have to say about the question that I ask, right? So there, you've narrated debate, got them back on course, and you can continue your discussion, right? And so he thinks that this is this is kind of a tip, and it's not quite the Aikido move, but it's similar to it.
It's a way of summarizing in clear terms the illicit move the other person in the conversation has made, such as avoiding an issue or offering cleverly worded, deceptive, or distorted reasons.
Yeah.
So all good points, all good to take a pause before we move on to the third point in the Columbo tactic, and from there we'll cover chapters 7 and 8 next time. So thank you very much for joining us. Again, we appreciate all the watching and listening that you do. And if you can share it around, that'd be great as well. and patreon.com/Gave of the Cross. And we appreciate our Patreon supporters. So thank you very much.
Thank you. See you next time.